This is a homily for the fourth Sunday of Easter. The responsorial psalm comes from Psalm 23. The Gospel comes from the Gospel of St. John chapter 10, verses 1 to 10. To download the text of this homily as a PDF file, go to sundayhomilies.au. The fourth Sunday of Easter is traditionally known as Good Shepherd Sunday, because the Gospel is always taken from chapter 10 of John's Gospel. This year, Year A, we listen to chapter 10 verses 1 to 10. In Year B, verses 11 to 18, and in Year C, verses 27 to 30. The imagery of shepherd and sheep appears in multiple Old Testament passages in which leaders, and especially David, are described as shepherds. You may recall that David was tending his father's flock when the prophet Samuel came to anoint one of the sons of Jesse as the future king of Israel. A number of the Psalms, which are traditionally associated with David, use the imagery of the shepherd and his sheep. Today's responsorial psalm, Psalm 23, describes the Lord as the shepherd who guides his people Israel. The Lord is my shepherd, there is nothing I shall want. Fresh and green are the pastures where he gives me repose. Near restful waters he leads me. He revives my soul. In today's Gospel, Jesus applies one image to himself. He is the door. Later in the chapter, he will explicitly identify himself as the Good Shepherd. Although we associate the image of the Good Shepherd with John's Gospel, the Gospels of Matthew, Mark and Luke also use the imagery of shepherd and sheep. So, for example, Matthew in chapter 2 of his Gospel quotes the prophet Micah and the second book of Samuel about a future leader who will come from Bethlehem. What Matthew draws from this blended quotation is not just the birthplace of the Messiah, but the kind of ruler the Messiah will be. When he quotes the prophet, he makes sure to include and to emphasize that the one who comes from Bethlehem is a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel. In the scriptures, shepherd language is never sentimental. To shepherd is to take responsibility for the life and safety of the flock, to guide, protect, feed, and, if necessary, to stand between the sheep and danger. Israel's kings were always judged by this standard. When they failed, the prophets condemned them as bad shepherds, and God promised that he himself would raise up one true shepherd to care for his people. By placing this image at the very start of his Gospel, Matthew is saying that Jesus is that long-promised shepherd king, not a ruler who grasps power, but one who exercises authority through faithful care. This brings us to one of the most powerful shepherd texts in the Old Testament, Ezekiel chapter 34. The prophet uses shepherd and sheep imagery to deliver a sharp indictment of Israel's leaders and a profound statement of divine responsibility. The shepherds, Israel's kings, officials, and elites, are condemned for feeding themselves rather than the flock. They exploit the sheep, fail to strengthen the weak, heal the sick, bind up the injured, or seek the lost, and instead rule with force and harshness. As a result, the sheep are scattered, vulnerable to predators and without protection. In response, the Lord declares that he himself will become the shepherd of Israel. He will search for his sheep, rescue them from where they have been scattered, bring them back to their own land, and pasture them with justice and care. God also announces judgment within the flock, distinguishing between fat sheep who trample pasture and muddy the waters, and the weak sheep who suffer from their selfishness. The chapter culminates in the promise of one shepherd, a Davidic figure, who will shepherd the people on God's behalf, restoring peace, security, and covenantal faithfulness. The imagery powerfully reframes leadership as pastoral care and presents God as the ultimate shepherd who intervenes when human leadership fails. It is impossible to hear Ezekiel chapter 34 without sensing how deliberately John's Gospel echoes its promises. When God says through Ezekiel, "I myself will search for my sheep and look after them," the expectation is clear. God will act personally where human shepherds have failed. And yet, in John chapter 10, it is Jesus who speaks in the first person. "I am the door for the sheep. I am the good shepherd." What Ezekiel announces as God's own future work is now embodied in the person of Jesus. This is what gives such weight to Jesus' words in today's Gospel. He is not simply offering a comforting image, nor claiming to be one shepherd among many. He is stepping into the role that Ezekiel reserves for God himself, the one who knows the sheep by name, who gathers rather than scatters, who protects rather than exploits, and who places his own life between the flock and danger. In John chapter 10, the long indictment of false shepherds reaches its resolution. The shepherd Israel was promised has finally come, and he comes not with force, but with self-giving love. Let's return briefly to the imagery of shepherd and sheep in the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Both Matthew and Luke have the parable of the lost sheep, in which we have clear echoes of Ezekiel chapter 34. We're left in no doubt that Jesus is the shepherd who leaves the 99 sheep to go in search of the one that is lost. In Matthew's Gospel alone, we find the parable of the sheep and the goats. Jesus is presented as a shepherd who separates the sheep from the goats. During the Last Supper, in the Gospels of Matthew and Luke, Jesus quotes the prophet Zechariah when he tells his disciples that they will all fall away from him. "I shall strike the shepherd, and the sheep of the flock will be scattered." Finally, in Mark's Gospel, we're told that just before the feeding of the 5,000, Jesus has compassion for the crowd because they are like sheep without a shepherd. Matthew has the same image, but in a different context. It is obvious that the evangelist John has taken the imagery of shepherd and sheep found in the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and made that imagery explicitly Christological. In other words, shepherd imagery in Matthew, Mark, and Luke describes Jesus' activity. In John's Gospel, it defines Jesus' identity. Let's now turn to the image that Jesus uses in today's Gospel. "I am the door for the sheep." The Greek word that John uses is thura, and that may have sounded slightly unexpected to a first-century listener, because it is the word that is usually translated as door. In English, for example, we wouldn't talk about the door to a sheepfold. We'd call it a gate. However, John's use of thura is not primarily about choosing one architectural term over another. The Greek word thura refers to the door of a house, the entrance to a courtyard, the opening to a room, or, more broadly, the point of access between two spaces. It refers not only to a doorway as a physical structure, but also to what happens there, entry and exit, being allowed in or kept out. In this sense, thura can mean more than just a door. It can also carry the simple idea of access. When Jesus refers to himself as a thura, he is using an image that would have been familiar to people in first-century rural Palestine. Sheepfolds generally did not have gates or doors. They were simple stone enclosures, often circular or roughly oval, with a single opening. At night, when the sheep were gathered inside, the shepherd, or one of the shepherds, would lie down across that opening. Quite literally, the shepherd became the door. There was no other way in or out of the sheepfold except over his body. Entry and protection were secured not by wood or iron, but by the shepherd's presence. The dangers for first-century Palestinian shepherds were real. Robbers and bandits were a genuine threat, especially in more remote areas, and Scripture itself regularly refers to theft and violence against flocks. There were also wild animals. Wolves, explicitly mentioned in the Gospels, were a real danger to sheep, particularly at night. Nocturnal scavengers such as jackals and hyenas were also common and could attack vulnerable animals. These were not imagined risks, but part of the ordinary reality of pastoral life. It was precisely because of these dangers that shepherds slept across the entrance to the sheepfold at night. With no gate or door, the opening was the most exposed point. By lying across it, the shepherd placed himself between the flock and whatever threatened it. Anyone or anything seeking access to the sheep, whether benign or hostile, had to pass by him first. Protection did not come from walls or barriers, but from the shepherd's presence at the opening of the fold. This practice explains the force of Jesus' claim. To say, "I am the door," is not merely to say, "I am the way in," but "I am the one through whom safety and life are found." The shepherd does not watch from a distance. He occupies the most vulnerable place. The image points beyond sheep to people. Jesus presents himself as the one through whom they find safety and life, the one who stands between them and danger. When Jesus identifies himself as the door, he places his own body at the point of danger. Later in this chapter he will say, "The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep." In today's gospel, Jesus says his sheep know his voice. To understand why that matters, we need to step back into the world of first-century Palestine. Sometimes several shepherds would share the same sheepfold, even though that meant that the flocks would intermingle. The obvious question then arises, How in the morning were the sheep sorted out? The journalist and pioneering travel writer H.V. Morton wrote a fascinating book in 1934 entitled In the Steps of the Master. It is an account of his visit to the Holy Land before the establishment of the modern State of Israel. The modern State of Israel was established in 1948. Morton had observed some Palestinian shepherds tending their sheep. At nightfall, 2 shepherds ushered their sheep not into a sheepfold, but into a cave. Here's how Morton describes what happened in the morning. Sometimes the shepherd talks to the sheep in a loud sing-song voice, using a weird language, unlike anything I have ever heard in my life. Early one morning I saw an extraordinary sight not far from Bethlehem. 2 shepherds had evidently spent the night with their flocks in a cave. The sheep were all mixed together, and the time had come for the shepherds to go in different directions. One of the shepherds stood some distance from the sheep and began to call. First one, then another, then 4 or 5 animals ran towards him, and so on, until he had counted his whole flock. What Morton describes makes Jesus' words easier to understand. Such a scene must surely lie behind the saying, "My sheep listen to my voice. I know them, and they follow me." Cistercian monk Michael Casey tells us that in 1941, the great theologian Karl Rahner published a book in which he tried to isolate the quality that sets human beings apart from the rest of creation. His conclusion was that only a human being can be described as a hearer of the word. This title refers not merely to our ability to make use of language, but more especially our capacity to hear the word who is beyond all words, the self-revelation of God. The difficulty, of course, is that we are often reluctant listeners. Charlie Brown asks Lucy, "Do you think you're a different person from what you were last year? Do you think you've really changed? I remember last year you said you were going to try to be a better listener." What? The Australian social commentator Hugh Mackay explores our reluctance to listen in his book, Why Don't People Listen? He argues that it is easy to accept that we are products of our experience, but not so easy to acknowledge that we are also prisoners of our experience. It is as though we are engaged in a lifelong process of constructing personal cages around ourselves. The bars of our cages are all the things that life has taught us: our knowledge, our attitudes, our values, our beliefs, our convictions. Mackay argues that our reluctance to listen is legendary, and there are many physical and psychological reasons why that is so. The first and most important reason why we so often fail to listen is that we don't have the courage to do it. Courage? Why does listening require courage? Listening is one of the most psychologically courageous things we ever do in our normal personal relationships, simply because listening, real listening, involves seriously entertaining the ideas of the other person. That entails the risk of having to change our minds in response to what we hear. If we listen properly, if we listen attentively, if we listen as if we are truly entertaining, trying out the ideas of the other person, we may find that we will have to take what is said into account, and that may well involve some cage work on our part. Listening is an act of great courage, because when we listen, we make ourselves vulnerable. When we listen, we run the risk of finding that we were wrong. To change our minds about something is to demolish and rebuild part of the cage, to admit that we got it wrong, to accept that an alternative view is better than the one we had learned from our own experience, or constructed out of our own prejudices. Set alongside Jesus' words about the sheep who know his voice, what Mackay has said is deeply challenging. To listen is not a passive act. It is an act of trust, vulnerability, and openness to change. It requires a willingness to begin the hard work of dismantling the cage we have built around ourselves. And that is precisely what Jesus is describing when he speaks of sheep who hear his voice and follow him. Listening in John's Gospel is costly. To hear Jesus' voice is to allow it to question other voices that claim authority over us. Or, to stay with Mackay's metaphor, to begin breaking free from the cage that imprisons us. That cage is built from cultural expectations, religious certainties, fear, and self-interest. Listening opens the possibility of being led somewhere we had not planned to go. That is why hearing and following belong together. The sheep who recognize the shepherd's voice do not merely hear his voice, they respond to it, they move. In John's vision of discipleship, to hear rightly is already to begin to follow, and following Jesus leads to life in its fullness. I have come that they may have life and have it abundantly. John begins and ends his gospel with this theme. In the final chapter of John's Gospel, the disciples have returned to Galilee. It is night time, and Simon Peter decides to go fishing. 6 of the disciples join him. The disciples toil all night in the darkness, but they catch absolutely nothing. In John's symbolic world, this detail matters. Darkness is not simply a time of day. It is a way of speaking about life lived without reference to Jesus, life cut off from him. Work undertaken in darkness comes to nothing. At dawn, a figure appears on the shore of the lake. We know that it is Jesus, but the disciples fail to recognize him. This stranger, standing by the shore in the early morning, calls out to them, "Throw out your net to starboard, and you'll find something." So the disciples lower their nets, and to their utter amazement, they catch a huge haul of fish. Obedient to his command, in the light of day, they experience abundance beyond all expectation. This final sign at the end of the Gospel calls to mind the very first miracle in John's Gospel. At a wedding feast at Cana in Galilee, the wine runs out. To run out of wine was not simply a social embarrassment, it entailed a serious loss of family honour. The mother of Jesus tells him what has happened, so Jesus gives instructions. Fill the jars with water. The water is then changed into wine, and not just any old wine, but an abundance of the finest wine. So here at a wedding feast at Cana in Galilee, Jesus gives a command. Fill the jars with water, and there is wine in abundance. At the end of John's Gospel, by the shore of the Sea of Tiberias, Jesus gives another command. Throw the net out to starboard, and there are fish in abundance. At the beginning and at the end of the Gospel, obedience to Jesus' word leads to abundance of wine and of fish. These signs point to the truth of Jesus' claim, I have come that they may have life and have it abundantly. When Jesus speaks of life in abundance in John's Gospel, he is not promising a life that is easier, safer, or more successful by ordinary standards. Life in abundance is not about having more, but about being more fully alive, living in the light rather than in darkness, shaped by truth rather than illusion, by trust rather than fear. It is the life of those who follow the shepherd's voice, not because they know where the path will lead, but because they know the one who is calling. And that raises the decisive question, who is the one who is calling? In today's Gospel, we encounter one of the great I am sayings found only in John's Gospel. I am the door. The words I am translate the Greek expression ego eimi. John's Gospel uses ego eimi in three distinct ways. First, they are used with a predicate, so I am the bread of life. I am the light of the world. I am the door for the sheep. I am the good shepherd. I am the resurrection and the life. I am the true vine. In these sayings, Jesus identifies himself through images drawn from ordinary human experience, but which point beyond themselves. Second, the words are used without an explicit predicate, but where one may be implied. A good example occurs when the disciples are crossing the sea by night. The wind rises, the sea becomes rough, and they see Jesus walking towards them on the water. They are terrified, but Jesus says to them, Ego eimi me phobiste. It is I, do not be afraid. On one level, these are words of reassurance. It's me, Jesus, not a ghost. But in the biblical tradition, to walk upon the sea, trampling the forces of chaos, is something that belongs to God alone. This scene functions as a theophany, a moment of divine self-disclosure, and the words ego eimi carry that deeper resonance. Third, and most strikingly, John uses ego eimi without any predicate at all. For example, when Jesus says, before Abraham came into being, I am. Here the words stand on their own, solemn and absolute. This takes us back to the book of Exodus chapter 3 and the story of Moses and the burning bush. Moses, tending a flock of sheep, sees a bush that is on fire, yet not consumed. God speaks to him from the bush and commissions him to lead the Israelites out of Egypt. Moses asks what he should say when the people ask for God's name. The reply he receives in the Hebrew text is Ehir Asher Ehir. The verb ehir can mean I am or I will be. The name God gives is often translated as I am who I am or I will be who I will be. When the Hebrew scriptures were translated into Greek, this phrase was rendered as ego eimi haon, I am the one who is. So when Jesus repeatedly and solemnly says ego eimi in John's Gospel, he is deliberately echoing the divine self-revelation at the burning bush. The I am sayings are not merely poetic metaphors, they belong to the language of revelation. When Jesus says, I am the door, he is not only explaining how people find life, he is also revealing who he is.